Thank you all for inviting me to this very interesting gathering of, from what I can see, people who've been actively involved in various protests across the Balkans. Indeed, as Aleksandra said, this is confusing. Yeah, you see so many people on the streets, very often motivated by particular reasons that has to do, that are often related to the local context or a national context, and that could be, to fully understand them, they need some sort of framing. But what we can certainly see that the sort of age of protest is here with us. And it's been like this for last, I would say, 10 years, or even to be more precise, since the crash of 2008. And I'll come back to this crash and to this watershed moment in today globalized capitalism, when it was clear that financial capitalism has many cracks and that actually the devastation that it can cause became evident to everyone. It also opened a possibility across the globe, but most specifically in the post-socialist Europe, to criticize capitalism as system, which was not something we hear from Eastern Europe. It seems that the watershed year for a moment for Eastern Europe is still the fall of the Berlin Wall. But things are not the same in Eastern and Central Europe and in the Balkans, as we all know. So this was a major event for what I would call progressive and left forces across the globe, 2008 namely, that in a way, as I said, open up a possibility for a critique, but also a possibility to think about alternative futures, alternative modes of political organization, and alternative modes of socioeconomic organization. Now, where we are 10 years after that, that's something we are certainly going to discuss a lot here, and I'm going to say a few words about it. But before that, I want to go back in history. I want to go 40 years back in history to the moment that is not only signaled the rise of neoliberalism, but also the end of a revolution, the end of an idea that a revolution is possible in this world, especially in the West. And this happened at the end of the 70s. 68 did not bring about a world revolution. It changed a lot of things, but it did not bring a revolution about. 70s, there were many promises of revolution in countries like Italy in the 70s or Portugal. That didn't happen. Then there was this last moment of resistance towards the growing neoliberalism with the election of François Mitterrand in '81. Only 2 years later, it was clear that this is not going to be an alternative model to the neoliberal one, that we are not going to see socialism in Europe, and that pretty much was it. Neoliberalism became the only game in town, accepted by the parties from the left. Electoral democracy also became only game in town, accepted by former revolutionary parties as well. And '89 signaled the end of socialist regimes, of state socialism, of that model that collapsed so quickly and without much violence. Of course, that violence was reserved for the Balkans, where self-managed socialism disappeared already at the end of the 80s, where '89 was not that moment because we consider the fall of Berlin Wall as something progressive and good, and people celebrated it, so that everybody will be able to enjoy privileges we had under Yugoslav socialism. And this makes the whole difference how you approach today reality, which is the nature of socialist regime, whether you were in Poland or Hungary or actually in socialist Yugoslavia. However, so while we got into this, as all you know, and you see the examples of it in this exhibition, in the 90s, total rehabilitation of right-wing ideologies, outright fascism, not often called this name. People who usually call it nationalism, of course nationalism, with very clear fascistic practices, where the only resistance to this was mostly liberal one, mostly human rights-based one, and pro-democracy one. That resistance in the 90s did a lot. This is one of the places that resisted to the politics of the 90s. Many intellectuals resisted, many people, I gather around Feral Tribune or many numbers of human rights organizations, resisted the disaster that happened to us. And then there was this, now we know, false promise of the European integration. And I think this is looming over us. Only 10 years ago, people believed that the integration into the EU will solve the problems in the Balkans, certainly excessive nationalism, and will bring some well-being by, I don't know, trickling down some of the wealth from the EU to the Balkans. So both things turned out to be false. Not only that the EU did not integrate the Balkans fully, nationalism exploded actually in the countries that joined the EU, in Eastern and Europe and the Balkans, and we can observe this in Poland, in Hungary, in Croatia. We can see that nationalism is in full swing, and that the idea of capitalist transition that was, as it was told, delayed in certain countries such as Serbia, will bring any serious reforms or well-being, also turn out to be false. Not only that this is not true, but we are facing the situation in which basically we have a total devastation of the landscape that once used to be the landscape of socialist countries. Interestingly, this protest, only in one clip, someone speaks about it, and that's the clip from Romania, yeah? When the guy says, yes, you can, who could protest here, you can protest because you don't have children or loans or whatever. People who have this are not here, they are basically slaves. And this is the situation we got absolutely everywhere. What happened with the global left, and then I'll come back to the Balkan left, or the progressive forces, or whatever you want to call it, whether you are comfortable with this label or not. So clearly, two moments were important, and somehow they signaled, at least to my generation, that something is happening. We, certainly in the Balkans and Eastern Europe, did not really observe much the Zapatista revolution in '94. Nobody really was writing about that. Actually, not in there were too many reports in the West, apart from a certain number of leftist intellectuals, say in France, who were following what was happening, or of course Latin Americans who knew what was happening, that a certain type of revolution is going on, or rebellion, if you want, and certainly resistance to capitalist restructuring of American space, North and South combined. But what they didn't tell us, they told us about some people who went there into the jungle and decided to defy the government, but they didn't tell us much about the model they wanted to offer. They didn't want just to resist. And this was not just an armed resistance that we got used to. It was not a Guevarist resistance. It was a peaceful armed resistance that managed to somehow mobilize the masses there, mostly indigenous population, by promising them a different way of organizing, based in horizontal democratic practices, based in sharing, based in the sharing of the commons. So they offer not only resistance to the Mexican state or the capitalist system, but also the different ways of organizing. Interestingly enough, people will go back to the Zapatistas example to get some inspiration, but maybe 10, 15 years later. Then there was Seattle, or the famous Battle of Seattle, that announced that there is a new generation that is not maybe ready to accept everything as given, and that there is an alternative. That was, of course, violently suppressed. And then even more important, at least for my generation, there was Genoa in 2001, where we saw that there is a potential for resistance. However, that energy somehow moved and was expressed in a series of meetings called World Social Forum. And that was a very important organization of rainbow coalition of progressive movements across the globe, who maybe would not agree about everything, but would certainly agree in one thing, which is a resistance to neoliberal capitalism and rejection of violence. Those were the two elements you had to satisfy in order to join World Social Forum. And at the same time, in 2001, we had Argentina and the pink wave in Latin America that somehow, again, will become an inspiration for what is yet to come. World Social Forum is now, it still exists, but it seems to be a history because it's been supplanted by very real protest movements and revolutions, such as the Arab Spring or Occupy movements across the US and across Europe, and therefore a completely new age of protests. So moving from the discussions and fora into the streets. And here is where the Balkans somehow starts to fit in. Interestingly enough, and you will hear a lot about this, the watershed moment, this is open for discussion, but I think I could prove that this was the watershed moment for the post-socialist Balkan, was this famous occupation of the University of Zagreb, namely Faculty of Philosophy, and the establishment of plenum, of citizens' assemblies. That happened a couple of months after the financial crash, as if somehow that opened up a possibility. Not that people knew who were doing the plenum and occupation, what is about to happen. Not that they necessarily declared themselves as leftists. Not that they were entirely sure what effects this will have. But the pure logic brought them to certain conclusions that were of huge importance for us. If you ask for a free and publicly funded education, you're going to ask why today we don't have it, why today we don't have free health, or why today we don't have what we used to have in socialism, such as free or available housing. And therefore, you're going to ask what happened and how you managed to dismantle that system and who benefited out of this. And if you are not ready to invest into education, in what kind of society you are going to create? Clearly, society that we are seeing around us, society of deep inequalities and deep social hierarchies, societies that certainly in the peripheries do not have much future, especially for younger generations. So the next step, so that brought you to the critique of the socioeconomic system. That is called capitalism. The word people don't like to use. It is called capitalism. And if you are criticizing this, you're criticizing capitalism. Maybe you are naive, as some liberal colleagues, to believe that there is a good capitalism and bad capitalism. Bad capitalism is in Eastern Europe. Good capitalism, don't just come up with Sweden and so on. That good social democratic capitalism is also disappeared. So this is where we are. And then the students at the University of Zagreb realized that if we are criticizing that system, we are also criticizing something else, the political system that made possible this socioeconomic system. So what is this political system? Well, a representative democracy. Liberal electoral democracy in which all politics is reserved to political parties. And you've been called upon every 4 years to cast your vote, but actually what happens, they all look the same. They all have the same policies. Maybe they distinguish whether they want same-sex partnership or marriage or not. So basically the question of values that then distinguish between left and right, but when it comes to economics, they're all pretty much the same. So what you realize that so-called center-left and center-right elites are pretty much one and the same because they have same policies. and elections are just elections to elect within a given hierarchy or oligarchy people who will just hold office. So basically, democracy does not change anything. Going and voting does not change much. And we do not live in democracy. We live in pretty much oligarchies that are just called democracies or like to call themselves democracies. So once you pointed out on these two problems, socioeconomic one and the political one, you were pushed to show something different. And therefore, this is what gave rise to plenum movement in a way, or that gave rise to the idea that plenum might be a way of organizing people in a horizontal manner in which different wave of social relations will be established. You might agree with this, you might think it's not effective, you might think it's a model that is good only for smaller groups. That's absolutely open for debate, and I'm sure we're going to discuss it. But this opened up an imagination. And that imagination then spread across the Balkans. Luckily, people do communicate, do travel, do learn from each other. And then one of the results of it was the series of occupation of university, Ljubljana, Belgrade, Skopje, Tuzla, where this happened, and then protest in Bosnia with the plenums establishing the cities, which was a miracle in itself. Of course, a miracle that could not change the system, that miracles do not change, that has been imposed after the war in Bosnia, and that you cannot change just by organizing in plenums. For that, you would need much more of a political force. But this is equally valid for other Balkan countries. And this is where we come to the situation in which many movements of progressive movements, left movements, movements that contain the critique of the system we live in, are facing today. So they face the fact that you can organize this fantastic plenum and plena everywhere, that you can organize this extraordinary protest, but that things do not change. And this brings a lot of frustration. So 8, 9 years later, many people are a bit older, got more experiences, realizing that pulling out these miracles, again, is not enough, and are today discussing various strategies how to change things. So what are these strategies? Again, we are going back to this dilemma that's been widely discussed between prefigurative and strategic politics. Let me call it that way. What do I mean by prefigurative? I mean all these examples, some of which we saw, but let's go back to the occupations of universities and the plenum, where we offer a model. We show it would work. It's of course limited in space and it's limited in time. But we prefigure a future we want to have. We want to have a future in which people will be organized in a more participative, more democratic way. We want to see the future in which we are not going to be, in which we are going to be socially equal, and we are going to show what the sharing economy is, what the commons truly is, how to share commons and not to exploit them commercially. We want to show how do we relate to our environment. We want to show a different, that not even different democracy, but different economy is possible. And there are many examples of it across the globe. Usually, they are prefigurative. It means that they will end. But some traces will remain. And like many of us who were part of plenum movement and participated in many of these things, that changes us completely, psychologically, intellectually, emotionally, and so on. And made of us, successfully or unsuccessfully, people who are engaged or even activists in all sorts of ways. Therefore, prefigurative acts, do have a meaning and do have a force on their own, although very often they're going to bring us to despair, because plenum will end, protest will end, and then what? And our life will also end, as Borka said. The idea is, of course, while we are still around, we should do something. Now, what would then be strategic politics? This is the question on which we discuss and debate heavily everywhere in the world. Some people would say, well, we have to go into politics, into official politics, into elections, or we should form different type of parties, and we should form different type of movements that could also infiltrate the institutions of a given regime and change it from within or influence it from within. There are some people who will say, this is good, let's try this, but let's not lose the contact with the movements or with the people we are fighting for. And there are people, of course, who will say, no, if you go into the institutions, you'll get corrupt, institutions are corrupt, this is over. However, this is pretty much the landscape. Now, we can agree or disagree. Probably each of us is making decisions at any given moment what option we are going to support. There is no formula to solve problems. If there is one, I don't think we managed to really still discover it. Maybe it exists. However, what we saw is that after the movement of places, of squares, of occupations of universities and theaters, much of this energy is now placed either towards the established parties or towards the parties that have been established from the movements. And there are some encouraging signs, such as Podemos, or United Left in Slovenia, or recently formed Zagreb is Ours movement, grouping leftist parties and organizations, and they won 10%, 8% at the recent Zagreb elections, and for the first time they're going to enter the Zagreb parliament. And they showed that this is possible to have such a progressive agenda and actually have some impact on the system as it is. Many of you were probably this morning following the news from Britain, whether Corbyn made it or not, and apparently he's done a good job, maybe not winning the elections, but certainly showing that it's possible to reform based on younger generation, the old Labour Party. However, again, one thing is to go to the elections, to score some points. The other thing is what happens when you get into power, when you get elected, and whether Corbyn, if he gets elected, will be able to implement some of his manifesto. And there we come to the moment of huge pain for progressive left, which is Syriza, and the coming to power of the party that represented the movements from the street and that had the agenda that I believe most people here will sign. And they got elected. And then we face the disaster, or see the disaster happening once when it became absolutely clear to everyone that the power is not in that parliament at the Syntagma Square, neither in Prime Minister's office, that the power is not in Greece at all, and that they could be crushed very easily by extraordinary powerful forces of global capitalism. And now we are still living this drama of the left running austerity measures in Greece as the lesser evil, if you want. But we are certainly, as we can see, the attention of the left move from Greece. We also here have to see these fashionable moments. So for many years, Greece was a focus of our attention. Now it's Corbyn, tomorrow will be someone else. This also tells a lot about us and about these media-produced moments of euphoria that, and here's the irony, are often circling around certain persona. So here now about Corbyn. And so many people who came from the horizontal democratic movements now suddenly look there for leaders and then try to justify it by reading Laclau and the ideas of the left populism. And many people accepting something that maybe 30, 40 years ago would only seem as a reformist agenda, certainly not a revolutionary agenda. And Jeremy Corbyn is a great example of this. Vilified as a radical leftist, his program is just of a, say, moderate social democratic leftist. So the question is, if we know what we are fighting against, and now those are three things. We are fighting against unjust socioeconomic system, we are fighting against false democracy, but we are also now fighting against the third very important thing, that even institutions of this false democracy has been captured by the right-wing conservative and pro-fascist forces. In many countries this is the case, in some other countries this is going to happen or it's already happening, so that we are facing a lot of enemies here. It's not just the global capital, it's a very reinvigorated right-wing fascistic movements and parties who are ready to change our realities. And again, it's not just elite somewhere in Brussels or these liberal oligarchies that we have to fight. So, a lot of enemies, but again the question, what do we fight for? What do we want? Now there, we're going to see all splits that we see in leftist and progressive movements. If you see so many people in Romania fighting against corruption, I mean, these people know why they are there on the streets, because they are frustrated, there is anger and so on. But they have absolutely no critique they have a critique of the system in their country. They certainly didn't develop a critique of capitalism as such. That's impossible still in Romania. And let alone they develop an idea of what society they want. It seems that they would like a good capitalism. Well, good luck with that. I'm not sure it will ever come there. People also on the streets on Belgrade. Although the director put Darko Rundek and his rendition of famous leftist communist song, Ai Carmela, these people are not leftist. Most of them would not declare as leftist. Therefore, what do they want? Do they want better laws, non-corrupt government, better urbanism? Do they want social justice? In what way? What kind of city do you want? What kind of state do you want? That's not clear. And of course it's not clear. We are living in confusing times. People you saw in Zagreb, 50,000 people, the massive demonstrations, only two happened. In '96, against Tudjman government that stopped the radio 101 in Zagreb, there was like 40, 50,000 people. And in last year, it's a rainbow coalition of people who certainly could agree around anti-fascist agenda and anti-clerical agenda, but not about anything else. Nor they were able to produce any idea of what kind of society they really want unless you want to count banners of the fringe leftist group who would say, down with capitalism. But that doesn't express really the feelings of these crowds. The crowds are out there. They know something is wrong, but they don't know how to fix it. They don't have a strategy how to fix it. They don't have a strategy how to change the world we live in, and certainly they don't have a vision. Maybe because they don't have a vision, that they don't have a strategy how to achieve that vision. And I'll leave you with this point, and I'm sure we're going to have very fruitful discussions. Thank you.
Okay, so we are now opening our first panel. It is designed to make a sort of introduction by people who were trying to analyze and present their research and observe and participate in some of the processes. So Borka and I will talk with today. Okay, Michał Sutowski from Krytyka Polityczna in Warsaw. Özge Çelikaslan, our colleague from Istanbul. Filip Jovanovski, our colleague from Macedonia, Skopje. Irena Pejić, our colleague from Mašina, Belgrade. Welcome, Irena. And Jelena Veljić, our colleague from Belgrade also, from Social Center Oktobar. I should also say from CZKD from a few years ago. So, I will, you all have this program, but I will try just to remind you of biographies of our participants here. So, Michał is a Polish political scientist, obtained his MA at the University of Warsaw in 2009. Since 2007, he's an activist and columnist for online Krytyka Polityczna. I recommend you to check out this magazine, with his main fields of interest being political economy, European integration, German and post-Soviet politics, as well as history of ideas in CE region. Özge. Well, Michał, we agreed in CZKD for the first time, but Özge was here a few years ago, and we fortunately now have the opportunity to present this valuable research. Artist, activist, and PhD scholar, her study focuses on political media archives, co-founder and member of video artist activist collectives, and since 2013 she's been working on bak.ma, open digital media archive of social movements in Turkey. Filip. Probably many people in Belgrade already know Filip. He's often our guest here in Belgrade. So he's a visual artist and civil activist, postgraduate studies at the Faculty of Fine Art Department, painting in Skopje. He often uses a curatorial approach in his works and creates socially engaged projects, often working with local communities. In 2016, he realized his durational project called Center for Art and Culture, Textile in Štip, where he created, along with textile workers, a 2-week program designed for their needs. He has participated in many exhibitions, and 2007, he's artistic director of Festival of Contemporary Arts Akto in Bitola. Irena. Irena is a sociologist, PhD student at the Faculty of Philosophy in Belgrade, primarily interested in political sociology, especially focused on critical analysis of right-wing politics and ideology. She has been a journalist of web portal Mašina since 2016, where she contributes in collective work aimed at building a left-oriented media platform. She also worked with many civil organizations in areas of social research of poverty, politics, and feminism. And our colleague, Jelena Veljić, just a second, activist. During her studies of ethnology and anthropology at the Faculty of Philosophy, she became involved in the student organizing. She is also a member of the informal collective Anti-Fascist in Action. Her main focus of social engagement includes the struggle for free and affordable education, feminism, workers' issues. She contributes to the work of Social Center Oktobar, one of the member organizations of Left Summit of Serbia. About the organizations that our participants are involved with and contribute to, you can also read in the program, but we will probably hear that in our panel now. So just a note before we start, we will have 2 rounds of, let's say, questions and answers about the issues involved, and then we will open floor for your questions. Since I have better sight, I will moderate this conversation with the audience, and now I would invite Borka to moderate the conversation with our panelists.
Yes, thank you. I think that you become boring, I mean, because then a lot of people get out. But that is a question. I mean that, Igor, actually you were talking about this whole history and, of course, the impact, but for what those people are fighting for? For freedom. You know, when you summarize everything, it's always a human necessity and wish for freedom. And those women in Poland, they are fighting not to be slaves. So those people are fighting not to be slaves and to be free. Against corruption, against what? But first, what you say about vision is to be free. And this is the subject of this round table, including all these questions which are here. But first, I want to congratulate it to somebody between us, and this is Filip Jovanovski. They succeed. The government in Macedonia is changed. So congratulations, Filip. It doesn't mean that no one changed. And we are going to hear about your experience because, you know, I mean, how you were fighting for years against ugliness, against lies, against corruption, against kitsch, against slavery in every sense. So let's begin like this, and I want just to say that the rebel man, like Albert Camus says, it's a status of mind. I mean, to be rebel, that means that form your character in that sense. The first human wish and the right is to be the man, what Camus will say, rebelled man. And this is the fucking story about 20th century and further. In this time in which Boris Budin mentioned 2 days ago, that probably the French encyclopedists are guilty for the French Revolution because it was terrible. And it is also the reconstruction of history in a sense. The October Revolution was also terrible, and that the world is moving by this in the medieval century with such a reconstruction, which doesn't mean only this, but it goes further. That means no revolutions, no changings. Let's be satisfied, like it is. So the question is of some kind of give a word to the human being which is in a status in rebel, not in the status of slavery. And this is also the part of all of this analysis. A wish to live and not to survive. Every moment when I hear that the society or somebody wants to survive, I feel terribly because we want to live, not to survive. And survive is a surviving guide of today. I will not bother you anymore. We will proceed. Michał, you will be the first. I just, listen, you keep Satsa. Sorry, just you keep your time. I mean, we don't have any agreement.
Introduction from about the organization you come from and some social context of your work. And then I think...
and go on the point.
I will help.
Don't
Borka.
retold.
Okay.
Go on the point.
So I would make short intro for Michał. Krytyka Polityczna is a very active political, let's say, point of a critique in Warsaw. I was impressed last year when I saw how big, let's say, interest revolves around you, and one of the rare punctums of public forums. So in that sense, it would be nice to hear your analysis of not only your work within Polish context, but Central European context that you analyzed in past however long you write about it. So Central European context of those changes and protests and right-wing and recent protests in Poland that are encouraging. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me. First time in my life in Belgrade and in the center. I liked it very much. You know, I think I wanted to talk actually about the three kinds of protests that we had in Poland very recently. I think they have some things in common, some things not. I'll try to elaborate a bit about the general idea, what they are about, and what they have in common, and what political potential they have. These three movements, I'm speaking about the situation after the elections in 2015 in October, when the right-wing, well, conservative populist or nationalist populist actually government or the party, the parliamentary majority won the election and started the government led by Prime Minister Beata Szydło, but with a clear all people in Poland know that she's not the woman in charge. Who is in charge is of course Jarosław Kaczyński, like leading from behind. And what happened after that, I think we had a few waves of civic mobilization. I would like to mention three of them. The one is COD, the Committee for Defense of Democracy. The second is so-called Black Protest, or the All Polish Women's Strike, because these are like two notions that are associated with that. And the third is a large protest against the schooling reform. So these are three civic movements, which all of them are sort of reactive, meaning that they are a reaction against what the ruling majority did. But on the other hand, they have, in my opinion, some sort of universal potential, meaning they can be a base for a totally new political identity. They have very different class compositions. It's also important, but what they have in common is very important. That a very important segment of their base is the middle class, or at least this very specific segment of the middle class. The COD. So maybe first to the class composition. It's like in the case of COD, it's mostly urban middle class in very broad terms. So like from professionals and intellectuals to like teachers or people working in the public sector. Although it's not only in big city centers, but also in the smaller towns, there were a lot of protests and demonstrations organized by the local structures of COD. It's defined, in my opinion at least, that's my impression, in terms of generation. These are people like, this is rather the generation, let's say 30, 35 plus, with a rather low participation of younger people, and also the, so to say, aesthetics and the narrative of that is very much connected to the history of the civic resistance in late 70s and most of all in the 80s. So like the songs and the slogans are very much in connection to what was said and told and sung and chanted during the opposition demonstrations in the 80s. Which of course is a mobilizing factor for that generation, but in many cases it's hardly understandable for younger people. And like the political agenda is mostly defending the rule of law against the attack of the government, against, on one hand, against the Constitutional Court, and against the independent autonomous judiciary. On the other hand, and especially very recently, it was also about protecting Poland's, so to say, stay within the mainstream of the European Union, which was also very mobilizing for, which is very mobilizing idea in among the middle and older generations in Poland. It's sort of a paradox, but these are rather the middle-aged and older people who are mostly pro-European in Poland. It's like the opposite situation than to one in UK, for example, where, as we know, the younger people were voting for Remain, the older people were voting for Brexit. In Poland, this would be the opposite. The second movement I'd like to mention is, of course, the Black Protest, probably the most famous socio-political event of Poland in the last year. A sign of a great success for that was that all the classes and all the regions were participating. This was quite a common impression. but we must know we were making a research, we were doing a research on that in Krytyka. What is interesting, we organized a seminar on about the organizers of the black protest, and what is interesting, they really come, so the participants came from all the social strata and from all possible regions. But the organizers, they also come from very different regions, but these are mostly people, mostly women, with a relatively high cultural capital. So they are part of the middle class, in almost all cases with higher education, and in almost all cases with some experience of living in a big city, or living abroad, or studying abroad. But as I said, as to the participation, these were women and men of all classes and all generations as well. This was also important in comparison to COD. You have here people of all age. Sometimes you could observe 3 or even 4 generations at one demonstration. And what is also important is that this movement, although the agenda was a protest against the draft proposal for an extremely repressive abortion law, which would practically forbid abortion in all possible situations. I say practically because formally there were some possibilities to do that, but in practice it would be completely forbidden. But the participants and the slogans and the message of that was about, it was defined in terms of human dignity and the right to choose, but not necessarily towards like the women were saying we do not decide whether abortion is good or not. We only say it should be a woman's choice. This is why it connected very different women from different backgrounds, from very radical feminist groups to, I would say, center-right liberal women, like voting for civic platform and being in favor of the actual law. That is, it's so-called a historical compromise. Between like liberal Catholics and hardcore Catholics, but still, so as I said, there was quite a broad social base for that, probably thanks to the situation that the message was not very clearly defined what they expect. It was that they are against what the government proposes. This is one of the reasons why the social base was so broad. And what is also very important, the general mood was extremely anti-political, meaning not only that the women protesting are against the government or the government's proposal, but also that they do not want, there was a very skeptical approach towards like political flags appearing at the demonstrations. So participants didn't want any political in terms of party political involvement, because this was perceived as some way of capturing the natural, spontaneous civic grassroots protests by the political establishment, although we must know that two structures, the local COD structures and the structures of Party Razem, they were crucial in terms of organizing that, but without labeling and showing themselves at the demonstrations. So these are these two, and the third one, someone would say it's a very classical and typical social protest. This was the protest against the draft proposal of the schooling reform, but what was really unexpected and unprecedented in Polish case was the fact that against the school reform were protesting 3 actors at once, which until today they actually never created a coalition. This was the first time in history after 1989, meaning these were teachers' trade unions, these were the parents, and these were the local authorities, because in Polish system these are the local authorities who pay for schools. So this was a very unexpected coalition, which on one hand, probably will not be able to prevent the reform, so the government will probably introduce it, because the new school year starts at the 1st of September. But in my opinion, this protest will have an enormous long-term effect in two dimensions. The one is to show the possibility of such a social coalition. So of the groups which were traditionally perceived as having contradictory interests, and on the other hand, it could be an identity-building event for a very important group, very important from my point of view as someone who would wish some sort of progressive political party coalition in elections 2019, meaning the middle class of the public sector. Teachers are the trade unionized group, very strongly trade unionized, having who in that protest, they, in my opinion, start becoming a sort of a class for it, not only in itself, but also for itself, or at least a segment of class for itself, meaning the group which has a vital existential interest in having high quality public services accessible for all citizens. So I would say that what connects all these three types of protests, or three cases of protests, is that they politicized the society. Very different groups, although with a very crucial participation of the specific segments of the middle class, which is sometimes hard to accept for the political left in Poland, because when someone says that middle class is an important group, then it's perceived as a neoliberal bullshit, meaning that, well, we are all now middle class, which means there are no classes anymore, actually. Well, this is not true. There are specific groups who can define themselves as middle class and who can define their interest in a progressive manner, like, for example, being in favor of high quality state-sponsored, meaning like taxes-sponsored public services accessible for all citizens. It is also the other aspect of that politicization of the society is the raising public awareness that even the most general framework, like the constitutional liberal democracy, is something that is not like fixed for once, but is something that requires the social base and the active citizens' support. Each time, I think this is the biggest merit probably of Prawo i Sprawiedliwość and Kaczyński that made people aware of that fact. And this is also can be observed also in the so-called third sector of the civil society. So all this professionalized, sometimes perceived and sometimes really neoliberal NGOs funded from abroad. They until 2015, the huge majority of them was defining themselves as apolitical. We just doing like the civic activism, and even the word activism was sometimes too much. We just do our good job in terms of protecting like basic rights and so on. After 2015, the majority of the activists in that sector understood the simple fact that if you are not interested in politics, then politics can get interested with you. So this is, I think, what happened in Poland. Not only in Poland, I think the case with the CEUs, so the Soros University, and the protests and the mobilization in defense of that. It's also a similar case, meaning that the civil society, or the so-called third sector, who was very often accused of being too much professionalized, too much alienated from the society, and on the other hand being sort of a latent supporter for neoliberalism, I think these people understood that how much political they are, and I think in Polish case it moved. So the recent situations moved a lot of them towards left. I mean, they are now much leftist as they were, or as they seemed a few years ago. Yeah, so we have 10 minutes, so maybe I would end up here, but this was sort of a concise summary of what is happening in Poland in last year.
Thank you, Michał. I learned a lot. I had no idea about some of those components of the protest there. Filip, after Borka's congratulations, my question, should we congratulate you? What's going on in Skopje?
First, thank you, Borka, but I was thinking yesterday, maybe while we were traveling to Belgrade, when I got the invitation for this conference, the Times of Resistance, it was a few months ago, and the situation was very different from what is now. We have new government in the past, I don't know, 7 days. We have new Ministry of Culture, who is our friend. When I say friend, I mean activists who were on the streets in the past 10 years. So the situation in the positive way is really changed. But is it hopeful? We will see. The question that Štiks mentioned in the beginning, what should be the strategies? Should we stay on outside of the politics, or we should go inside? It's a question that is that the people in Macedonia are how to say, there are a lot of people who were activists now are in the parliament. Two or three very, very important activists now went. One of them in the Ministry of Finance, the other in the Ministry of Culture. So there is debate: should they go or not? So it's important question and important challenge in the moment, because, as I said, for example, on the first day when the mandate was, when the new Ministry of Culture got the new mandate, he invited us, people, activists, supporters of the opposition, to go with him in the cabinet. And on the media appeared one picture in one of the most important ministries of the previous government, because the previous regime actually ruled symbolically, and not only symbolically, and with the whole production of culture and the money that they invested in culture through the Ministry of Culture. And we went from the streets in the ministry with the new minister, and it was very important symbolical guest. And also it raised a lot of questions in the scene and between us. What should we do now? What kind of strategies we are going to make? Because there is one very important, I'm talking about now from the perspective of culture, because I come from the cultural background, artistic and cultural background. We have Skopje 2000 project as a manifestation of the totalitarian regime that we had in the past 11 years. So it's a very important question, and now we should see how we should deal with that problem. Actually, it's we'll see. My opinion, something should be left. That's my opinion. But some facades, for example, or monuments should be removed, because it's a crime somehow. It's made in a total violent way, and I think, but we should find a way how to solve it. So that's one of the challenges. I don't know the answer at the moment. What is important to mention for Macedonian context, when I saw these videos, I just think in Macedonia things started with violence and ended with violence. Actually, one of the first important movements that appeared in civic movements was in 2009, after the reaction of the students of architecture through the protest that they organized, called First Architecture Rebellion, First Architectural Uprising. when the government announced that they would like to build Orthodox Church with public finance on the main square in Skopje. At that time, Skopje, the center was totally empty. There was,
I remember.
You remember? And the project Skopje 2014 wasn't announced yet. It was in March 2009. And what happened? On the opposite side, some of the propaganda media, I would like to read part of propaganda media. One of the main propagandists, called Yadi Burek, published on his blog and to call for a counter-protest. And he said, tomorrow at 12, on the square on Skopje, probably a group of gays and atheists will gather. And this violence somehow defined the ruling of the previous government and of the regime in all different manifestations. Maybe we had lucky that that we had the project Skopje 2014 in a sense of that this repressive and totalitarian politics were obvious somehow. Were
Tangible.
Yes, and their violence were manifested in many forms, and it ended on 27th of April this year, a month ago, with another very big violence when another group of counter-protesters called Initiative for Joint Macedonia, it was like counter-revolution of colorful revolution. They entered the parliament, the police left them with masks, and they attacked the MPs of the opposition, including the current Prime Minister Zaev. So somehow this is the circle of the violence in between where we try to fight and to invent new strategies how to fight. And I think we managed somehow to invent some strategies that will help to the new government to make real policies. Because you showed the video from Colorful Revolution, it's important to mention that that was maybe the last stage of the civic movements in this period. It united a lot of initiatives. And if we can say that Gruevski somehow with aestheticization of politics, which he done with the projects in 2014, went the society in some totalitarian, as Benjamin said, with aestheticization of the politics, you go to fascism. Colorful Revolution somehow de-aesthetized this process, because in this 3 months period of coloring the monuments, with the participation of a lot of citizens, I think that which is very positive in the next step of what we're going to do with the project Skopje 2000, they de-aesthetized the project. When you see these paintings on the Triumphal Arch, you see that's the work of the thousands of citizens that they've done in the period of 2 or 3 months.
If I understand, you said that this counter-revolution de-aesthetized this.
Colorful revolution. That's my opinion.
That's your opinion.
The colorful revolution. The people from the colorful. If Gruevski aesthetized his politics, they de-aesthetized somehow.
Okay.
Yes, but because we are talking in the
I understand.
artistic forms.
That's important for remarks. Thank you.
So that is somehow the circle that we can of the Macedonian context. We have a lot of violence. What else I can say? I don't know. As I said, me and my organization and my personal artistic approach, I'm trying to invent new strategies. You mentioned the project with the textile workers that we've done with my colleagues, and I think it's one of the strategies that we should apply. But later maybe we can talk about.
Certainly expand on that.
Thank you.
Thank you.
That's right.
Özge, you are dealing with strategies of, let's say, archiving the unarchivable so far. Our colleague Al Kirin wrote about this impossible archives of rebellions and suburban uprisings in Europe. And I thought of your archiving, let's say, learning process. It's a very unique, it was a very unique initial project a few years ago when you presented it. It resounded a lot, and maybe let's hear how you manage how you deal with the memory of protests, a different map of Istanbul, and what happened.
I'm very happy to be part of this event. Thank you for invitation. Yes, actually, for this session, I prepared a presentation focusing on Gezi movement, as we all discuss around this theme. And I want to tell about my experience about archiving at the other session. But briefly, as you also in the video, a piece, the voiceover is telling about looking and seeing, and our archive is called bak.ma. Bak.ma means don't look in Turkish. It's coming from a police announcement at one of the protests in Ankara in 1994 against F-type prisons. And it's really it's interesting because maybe you hear from the news that there's a hunger strike in Ankara. Yes, they are those two people who were dismissals of the policies which are created under the state of emergency after attempt coup of Erdogan's, which legitimized Erdogan's authority in Turkey. Two people started protests in Ankara. Today is 213th day of the protest and 94th day of their hunger strike. And they put them into prison. Now they are in prison. It's since more than 2 weeks. And it's interesting that police announcements during those protests they are just following the same structure, like normal citizens get lost or don't look. So I mean, we just want to use that term for our archive, and it's a digital media archive, and we put the footage of social movements. I'm a video activist. I have been on the streets and recording protests since 2004. But after Gezi movements, in our video collective, video activist collective, we also started bringing other collectives, other activists or syndicates archives, visual archives, but mainly video archives, and we digitalized some of them. So our archive has been enlarged after Gezi. It doesn't include only Gezi upheavals recordings, but now you can go to, for instance, 1977 Bloody May Day. We found the footage, we digitalized it, we got it from the syndicates, worker syndicates. And there are many, many documentation in the archive. It's from May Days, protests, 8th March, feminist march, or LGBT movements. We have a good connection with the LGBT movement. They are really active, especially since Gezi movement. They are they have a central role in the movement. Yes, I will tell our perspective in the how more on what's video activism, how how did we start like archiving, or our like perspective about archiving, the memory also, which is like related with your experience, practice here. Yes, I prepared a, let's say, short presentation. I want to follow through my paper. It's about mostly about Gezi. As you know, Turkey is a criminal country regarding human rights violations, social discrimination, and executions of its injustice policies. There has been always a resistance by organizations, syndicates, political parties, individual activists, and independent groups in various ways, like protests on the streets, marches, press releases, individual creative protests, and recently by digital media activism. But a social movement is a massive action, and it doesn't often happen, but takes many years. Speaking in terms of Gezi, it was an uprising, it was a resistant movement, and started with smaller group protests in order to protect the park and trees in Taksim Square. It turned into a mass action on the third day of the protests. It's related with the harsh intervention of the police towards protesters, as it was disseminated instantly by the activists sharing photos and live videos on social media. This soon spread to other cities in Turkey, and the focus of the mass protest became a fight for rights and democracy. Since 2012, there had been a public debate about the Taksim Square project, including Gezi Park, that was initiated by the Istanbul Greater Municipality, which has an upside down from that both public and professionals from the Chamber of Architects and Chamber of Urban Planners were against. This is another form of public space project initiated by governmental organizations, which aim to be a clean, controlled, high surveillance space, including the building of a replica 19th century Ottoman barracks called Topçu Kışlası, which is a military term, and said by the Prime Minister to include the construction of a shopping mall and a mosque. The project was designed without any participatory practices and without consulting civil society organizations and chambers. As soon as the project was announced to the public, the Taksim Solidarity Platform, combining civil society organizations, chambers, independent political groups, collectives, and individuals under its umbrella, initiated public protests, petitions, events, and a festival in Gezi Park in the following months to create a public opinion on the defense of public spaces that should be protected as cultural heritage of the city. Taksim Square is an actual space, but on the other hand, it has a political value for the authority and also for the opposition. Since 1977 Bloody May Day, that 38 people were killed by the police guns. Concerning Gezi movement, public space is a metaphor, but it's also an actual space, central zone of the movement, which was occupied and protected from the authority by the activists. It became a place of commune, a free sharing meeting space of various political groups, from Kemalists, liberals, secular party members, to Kurdish political groups, LGBT activists, feminists, anti-capitalist Muslims, radical left movement parties, and so on. So it was a colorful environment. It was also a learning process of the movements of each other. For instance, I witnessed how like homophobic football club members got their life lessons and learned from feminist groups that they have to stop their homophobic discourses. And as I said, LGBT people and feminists, those two movements gained widespread visibility at Gezi and were often cited as central to movements. Michael Hart also, who followed Gezi and Turkish politics very closely, he supports my thesis. He wrote 1 year after uprising that one of the most important and inspiring aspects of the Gezi encampments, in fact, was the way it opened the possibility for new political subjectivities and new articulations across the social spectrum. Rigid social divisions and previously seemed unbreachable suddenly seemed to dissolve among those together in the square. He also argued that since 2011, different from previous nomadic global movements, these new protests are rooted in territory, demand a new definition of publicity and commons beyond the false public-private separation. Furthermore, with their multitude form, these occupations and encampments provided a real ground where protesters constituted an inclusive and egalitarian togetherness characterized by their demands for real democracy. In fact, Occupy movements revealed that there could be a different kind of politics, which is interactive, inclusive, energetic, welcoming, decentralized, and creative. Perhaps the idea is not to provide direct answers through old political tools and methods, but rather to show that there are new social possibilities that transcend current repressive political systems and party politics. This may also an answer to his question. Gezi was energetic and interactive as it gave birth of its own media. Those media collectives born during Gezi, the radio stations, newspapers, and TV channels made a huge input on the action. Their main role was to reveal police violence towards protesters who were using their democratic rights, though they were being portrayed in Turkish mainstream media as if they were totally offensive, unfair, predatory, and looters. During the massive protests, a lot of people were injured of plastic bullets thrown directly at protesters' heads and upper bodies. Tear gas canisters were routinely fired directly at protesters, bystanders, and sometimes into residential buildings and medical facilities, resulting in hundreds of injuries. Chemical irritants were added to water cannon supply tanks. Female protesters were sexually abused by law enforcement officials. Live ammunition was used. 12 people were killed, and more than 8,000 were injured at the demonstration across Turkey. Most of them lost their eyes. In the history of Turkish opposition, there were many important movements, of course, mass protests and gatherings. But what makes Gezi efficient, strong, and inspiring is the gathering of all colors. But this also brought a discontinuity. Mass gatherings were dispersed and vanished sooner. Sociologist Vacant does not describe Gezi as a massive action. He rather describes it through class. For him, it was a petit bourgeois movement like in Egypt. He says that in Istanbul, young, university-educated, urban middle-class people having a city sensitivity attended to global developments. Hart also asserts that Gezi should be read in terms of labor. He says that it's striking how uniformly Gezi militants describe the class position of those most active in the movement as white-collar, urban, young, and highly educated, but often poorly paid and precariously employed. So I'm trying to emphasize different dimensions of Gezi movements, but one of the important achievements of Gezi was its creative intelligence, new and inspiring visual languages, potentiality of creating a political aesthetics and discussion around these issues, and formation of new organizations, collectives. We also have been using the term after Gezi or post-Gezi, or Gezi spirit. One of the main figures of post-Gezi was the open forums. Those new groups came together in the parks and created public assemblies, mostly in bigger cities, in Ankara, Istanbul, Izmir, but also in the periphery, not like in conservative towns, but let's say the cities, the towns which have a like tradition of like democracy or that culture. So they come together to discuss about the various issues like daily political agendas, effects of the movement, future of the political struggle, daily practical solutions to problems, and so on. One of the active group which survived until today were North Forest Defense, which is connected to ecology movements. They did a lot of efforts on protesting the third bridge and third airport, which killed the main green area in Istanbul. The forest was totally demolished. And Istanbul City Defense, and also like neighborhood defense groups created, and they still survive. But they are not really like I cannot say they are efficient enough. And several media activist collectives, of course, in Istanbul, Ankara, and Izmir mainly. There are like 5 or 6 still surviving media collectives. After Gezi, Turkish political agenda has been changed very rapidly. The authorities suppressed the power of streets through elections, harsh military interventions in Kurdish towns, by applying war politics, creating a fear atmosphere after many suicide attacks, and lately by the so-called attempt coup. Erdogan legitimized his authority, and his authority applied uncontrolled violence by claiming security reasons, terrorism, threats, and so on. Yes, and as I told about the latest protests, this is briefly how Gezi formed and what happened after the movement. And we have been trying to follow and document the situation, all those situations. It's enlarging the archive. It's also very depressive. I'm coming from a depressive situation, but I also realized how we normalized this violence. It's too violent. I mean, but it's on the other hand, it's really. There's a normalization process. It's tragic, but it's worth to discuss. I mean, yeah.
For this intro. Okay, it's my pleasure to have an analyst. You probably now see our hidden agenda here. We have analysis models and approaches from various fields and methodologies here. And one of the initiatives that really encouraged us a lot here in Belgrade is Mašina, a new model of, let's say, media. It's a media portal that gives some affirmation to starting writers, critics, and it's nice to have an opportunity to invite Mašina to comment on Belgrade Spring, on Belgrade protests. They covered very thoroughly events that shaped the spring in Belgrade. It's initial protests against the election fraud, which grew into something more, maybe, that we will ask Jelena afterwards. But first, what happened in Belgrade in spring, Mašina?
First of all, I have to say that Mašina and myself came from the field of media and political activism, so our perspective is a mashup of these two perspectives. In order to fully understand what happened in spring this year, or the appearance of the latest protest, I think that we should really have in mind the political and social context of Serbian society today. as we all know, after the collapse of socialism, we had a rule of socialist party that was socialist only by name, and the practice was nationalist and pro-capitalist. So the so-called transition from socialism to capitalism started in the 90s, during which the narrative of privatization of factories, of companies, and now the public sector was the dominant, became the main narrative in the mainstream politics, and these processes are still ongoing. So we have the consequences of these policies right now. So the current government, as well as the previous, since the 5th of October 2000, has been in a chase for a membership in the European Union. And that chase consider many goals, and when I say goals, I mean tasks that are driven by the European Union. So some of these tasks consider coordination of legislation. So in a few past years, we are witnesses of many law changes that are mainly in economics, and that new laws that are brought are unfavorable for working class primarily. So this past year was pretty much on the streets in Belgrade and in Serbia. We had numerous protests. First, we had protests against the Belgrade waterfront. That is the massive and very problematic investment project. We had strikes of public and private sector workers. We have feminist strikes, and of course the last series of so-called against dictatorship protests. That is something that was present in foreign media, but unfortunately not so much in domestic media. So we tried to cover these protests as as many detail as we could. Of course, the media in Serbia are owned by political elites, so we tend to give some left perspective when we follow these protests in our reports. So the protests that occurred this spring started right after the election. The election took place in April. I think it was 2nd of April. And there was no second round of election. Aleksandra Vučić, the prime minister at the time, won with 55% of votes. So the protests were organized spontaneously, as far as we know, on the social networks. I think that it's no surprise that it started with youth. And because the young people are fully unsatisfied with the situation in society today, so I think that the main actors was high school and university students, but through the day it grown even more. The main reason for protesting was an unfair and aggressive campaign of Aleksandar Vučić. And that led to his victory in the first round. So the protester pointed out the question of authority, legitimacy of the elected president, and with no political parties and other formal organization that were visible and labeled that are behind this protest, thousands of citizens spontaneously expressed their dissatisfaction. So that was the first reason for protesting, but not the only one. We nevertheless, that there were other reasons for people to came out on the street. Protests were organized not only in Belgrade, but in numerous cities in Serbia. The largest was in Belgrade. Average number of protesters per day was up to 10,000 or 15,000 people in first few weeks. So this at the time has passed. Other reasons for protesting started to be more visible by paroles and banners. We had banners that said we don't want to be cheap labor force. We want to stay in our country, and so on. So we had the demands that was and claims that were clearly diverse, but it was, I think, an expression of general discontent. So that is the common point of these demands at this protest. Political articulation has been spontaneously as well, and because no political organization pointed out their ideology, social and economic issues came to the fore. So these social demands and the political ones started to emerge very quickly. I think the third day of the protest we had this student of the University of Novi Sad they delivered the set of demands. They first of all asked for a resignation of some institutional leaders. They asked for freedom of media, abolition of austerity policies, and ending of cuts in public sector. So students called also for solidarity with workers in strike and workers' unions. In some point, it was clear that these young people realized that the main problem isn't the current government, but the main problem is the economic system itself and the policy that is currently supported by the current government. So I think there were some political potential in these protests, especially when unions that were army union and police union joined the students in protest. So I think that was the major event in Belgrade in the past few years, not only that day. So a reaction from government were pretty rarely, but yet were very problematic. Just elected president commented how the protesters could be on the street for all that they want if they have enough time to waste. So I think that is the example, the perfect example of the current narrative that unsatisfied people are seen as lazy, as subversive or something like that. So I think that that quote of the president elected is a perfect example how the society looks like today in Serbia. So still, even the protests are finished. We have some informal groups that are trying to preserve this idea of these demands that are delivered while the protests were active. We can discuss about these demands later. So this is the okay.
Thank you. So this is in a way intro also for Jelena. Well, you were talking about the protest. I remember, as usual, any protest that is related to students, and this was obviously, in Serbia always evokes the famous mythological protests from the 90s and those comparisons. And for the first time, I remember also plenum philology, even some professors complained how these students are not like students from the 90s, as if I'm the student from the 90s, we were some mythological creatures that are supposed to be the models of all student protests whatsoever. Those were failed student protests that we had. And I hope really that no student protest will ever look like our student protests. And not only that, but these times in a way shaped this spring protests into some really surprising soap opera with the protests. Like, who would ever compare 90s student protests with protests that are supported by unions of police and army? This is so unthinkable and uncomparable with the 90s. For me, that was refreshing, and the first line of defense, like, also against those critiques, like, this is not as witty and carnival-esque like student protests from the 90s. Like, no, but it has the support of unions, so okay. So if there is some kind of new horizon in political organizing of youth and students, and recognizing how important this horizontal solidarity and connecting different movements, if there is such a thing this spring, is there some kind of, let's say, historical context from the 2000s student struggles, and also some initiatives like Left Summit of Serbia of connecting student unions and all those initiatives. Is there also a future for that?
We'll see. I don't know about these protests that occurred this spring. I think that some people on the next panel that participated can speak in more detail about that. But, and I also agree that there are different kinds of protests than the protests in the 90s or in early 2000s. And so yeah, I also...
You have to speak louder.
Okay, sorry. Yeah, but there are some parallels. Irena told about what was the causes of this protest. It wasn't really focused at the very beginning, but it soon became more articulated towards some social issues. And yeah, maybe I can say something about what was going on in the last 10 years or so from...
That would be useful for contextualizing all those, yeah.
It's hard because I cannot really talk from like sociological perspective, but maybe to pinpoint some things that I find important, maybe for some other people they are not so important, and to see what was going on. So somewhere between 2006 and let's say 2011, there was a lot of student protests in Serbia. It was mostly focused on Krytyka of Bologna, on Bologna reform and its implementation, but also focusing from on the some economical side of it also, because less and less people had an opportunity to go into higher education, and so protests were fairly massive for these 2, 3, 4, 5 years. Some also occupations of schools occurred, and I don't know, maybe occupations of bridges and highways and stuff like that. But parallel to that, there was also a lot of workers protesting against privatization of their companies, because this huge wave of privatization that occurred after 2000, it was really problematic in its essence, but also because of a lot of corruption that was going on regarding that. So workers were protesting against that, and sometimes what would happen is that workers' protests and student protests would actually happen at the same place and gave each other some supports. And since in this organizing of student protests, some people that were active in leftist groups were also active in organizing student protests, and it led to establishing some kind of connections between students and leftist groups and workers groups that were involved in organizing their own protests. After somehow like people that were active from the left in student organizing, after finishing schools or becoming focused on something else, they kind of wanted to stay in touch with people from the workers' movement, and also some of the privatization ended really badly for the workers involved. And there was some need to create some kind of space or entity that would keep us all together. And in 2013, workers from Igor Media Factory, it was really a very important and big example of how privatization went totally wrong, how it involved some local tycoons, and the worker struggle around Igor Media was lasted for more than 10 years. Meanwhile, they at some point managed to get back the factory and to actually build their own factory, but had also suffered some repression from the government during that process and so on. So the workers from Igor Media initiated creation of this thing called the Left Summit of Serbia. And the idea was to involve like people from workers movement, from student movement, feminist organizations, queer organizations, all different progressive groups that are interested in some articulation of some left political position. By now there is 11 organizations in Left Summit of Serbia that are actually that involves also its main political document, which is called Solidarity Principles. It is articulated in 16 points around which we gathered as groups, and it is focusing on equality, solidarity, economical and political democracy, ecological sustainability, against right-wing politics, against privatization, and so on. It functions via meetings. Left Summit also does some actions or protests, participates in different protests that are organized by unions, cooperates with other actors, and so on. So this is what we thought that is important to do, just not to forget or focus on some particular struggles or issue, but to try to interconnect them and to create some kind of more thorough cooperation between those actors. I think it is important, like in Serbia there is a relatively developed also like anarchist scene, and also people that are involved in working with refugees, collectives that are involved, particularly border collectives, are also important for that topic. But it is also important to feminist groups feminist scene is pretty developed also, and it is important to try to interconnect these different topics and not to focus on one single issue at a time. So networking for us is like the main strategy in that sense, and also it leads to like all of the things that are sometimes considered not that important, but maybe also some exchange of experiences, which is important. I think sometimes it happens on the left scene, but also on some other scenes, that people that are becoming involved in some issues don't have enough of information about what was going on previously, and why some things are not that maybe possible to do anymore, or maybe some action should be more radical or whatever. So that is, yeah, that kind of networking I think is important. That is one side, and also the other side is, and this is why I think this conference is important, is the international issue. I think that for student movement in Serbia in 2010 it was important to participate in to be part of this larger European or Yugoslav, firstly Yugoslav and then European student protests, that there was a lot of exchange going on between Ljubljana, Zagreb, Skopje, Belgrade, Priština, Tirana, and at some point, as I remember, there was this large anti-Bologna protest going on in Vienna. It was European protest on 10th anniversary of Bologna Declaration, which gathered like maybe 15 to 20,000 people from all over Europe. University in Vienna was occupied. There was some ministerial ball or something like that. That was the plan was to try to protest during that ball. And it was really interesting to see how some things that for some people might occur as a local things or corruption-based things, or like Bologna is working in every other country and in Serbia not because of some local issues, that they are not that local issues, and they can be found in like every other country also. And I think that internationalism is really important for every struggle, and for worker struggles and student struggles. And so regarding left groups, it led to a creation of something which is very non-pretentious as a platform, and it is totally in the beginning, which is some entity that is called the League of the Balkan Left, which involves different left-oriented organizations from Slovenia, Croatia, Bosnia, Serbia, Kosovo, Albania, Macedonia, Romania, Albania, Bulgaria, Albania also, yes. But it is just a network for exchange of information and like international support network that is in process of creation. So, yeah.
Okay, thank you. This is a nice actually intro for the second round, which will be open for your questions also. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, that's what we can grasp now. I will just shorten and simplify it, and then to make it easy to open the discussion. First, what we heard and learned, the two very important points of your analysis and description is that the heritage of that, I mean, is basically politicizing of the citizens. That's very important. And the second is that pushing the non-NGOs or the non-governmental sector to the left. That's, for my opinion, very important, what you said. And that is a certain way, yes. That's what we heard from Filip, is this crucial connection between revolution, aesthetic, and art. I mean, this is what's actually happened in Skopje, this enormous changing, I will not mention identity, this is another thing, but that point of ecological and urbanistic factor and wild building in the contra-revolution and the revolution. While building is a contra-revolution, is against modernity, obviously, and that is this process, very important. Özge, this is a fabulous question inside of all of this. This is activity and archive that you put together. Yes, archive is activity, and this is fantastic, Teza, about this connection between containing archive and activity. And that's what I heard of. This is fabulous. It is about laziness and definitely the white race subversive. Yes, laziness today is subversive. Be lazy, it's subversive. That means having a time, thinking, maybe it is erotic. And this accusation of the student movement is crucial for let's say, statement of mine of this, yes, you are subversive, but this is a privilege. The whole history is subversive. And the laziness means this luxury. Luxury of time, imagination, and erotic. And that's what get nerves, all these oppressive forces, and that's great. And that's what Jelena actually supposed, and I'm so glad that it is, so many things are done. It is internationalism. She mentioned Yugoslavia. It will be delicate on another place, but not here. I mean, and that's the main point, and that's what actually we are gathering today, and we were gathering together is the connection. Not only the information, but that connection between the movements and between the people and the strategy which will come from that on the level of Yugoslavia, on the level of region. They said region. How to turn this region to some normal word? This is not a region. Please, I mean, and that when you lost Yugoslavia, then we become a region. And this is absolutely, I expect, Jelena, from you, that you will find a name during all the movements, during all the unification. You have to find, we have to find a name for this region. We have to find the flag. We have to find a symbol. And I really hope that this movement will brought this how to say, sense to the region. We just need a number, South Slavs, I don't know what. And this is extremely important, that connection, and I think that this conference is actually the part of it. So I just want to give some things which I noticed. Of course, there are much more broader, and then to invite you to participate in the discussion. And come on. Bravo, come. Sorry, I don't.
It's more a question to Filip. I don't think you can really answer, but I would like to have your opinion, because Özge explained, of course, afterwards, how the Gezi movement really produced all this new capacity for organization, this creativity, this new energized people. And since now you are at the end of this long process of protesting, of citizens getting involved in Macedonia, and hopefully maybe it's a victory, it's back to normal. I don't even know if we can say something like that. But for the more politicized, it's going to be this, as you say, the strategic debate. Do we enter the ministers, the government? Do we stay out, criticize, or change it from within? But for the wider movement of citizens who participated, do you already have some feeling that they are going to continue to keep being engaged, that it's a possibility for something new emerging, or that they are just going to go back to being disinterested? What's your feeling on that, or the clues maybe you have already?
My feeling is that there is big capacity that will not fade now when the government is changed, if that was the question. And that can be seen by a lot of debates arise on Facebook, especially when the government is changed. And from the first moment, criticizing like new decisions, new policies, what we are going to do. So I think that there is potential. I think that people will not stay now and get lazy, and I think that new forms of, that's my opinion, new forms of, I think that energy, there is potential for inventing new structures, more maybe official, that can deal with this, what we call Gruevism, because the Gruevism is not done. We changed the government, but there are still leftovers from the regime, from the totalitarian thinking, especially in the smaller places out of Skopje, where they have opportunity to have only only controlled media from the propaganda. So I think that we very serious work to do in the next years. So I don't think it will how to say, fade at the moment. For example, that's one interesting regarding Colorful Revolution and new Ministry of Culture. One interesting fact: yesterday he had an interview and he said that the traces of color that were on the Ministry of Culture on the facade, he will left. He won't clean, just to remind the citizens of the free spirit of the revolution, of the activism, which is, I don't know, one good sign that we are not forgetting all these movements and potential of the movements. So that's yes.
Don't do the mistake.
Any questions?
Questions, or if you want to say to participate, yeah.
Okay, while you were thinking, I missed to mention also the 1st of May protest in Belgrade, which was indicator also of some maybe new form of organization. Tomorrow, in the next panel, we will meet our friends from Don't Drown Belgrade initiative, but that was an example, pretty much scary one, to the authorities, how this kind of ad hoc solidarity with ongoing protests and workers and unions can be performed in Belgrade. I know perform is an ugly word for this, but actually in the meaning of factory performance, let's say. So my question would be, was that surprising? I remember also our support given to trade unions against the law on labor. I remember many of the attempts to connect different social groups, but this was really this was recent and connected to those protests, and it was constantly counted. The number of people who were present were counted by this or that political party. So it made some kind of impression to the authorities. It scared them. Do you think that was that surprising? I mean, the success of that kind of solidarity, and does it have a perspective as such? Is there some result in some kind of platform organization? I remember students from Novi Sad coming, and so is there a future for such kind of solidarity action?
So I think it's hard to talk about solidarity in a long run regarding some protests that occur at some point of time. So yeah, but I would like to talk about don't let Belgrade drown or whatever is the translation of that. But I think that is a good example of how to organize on local issues, how to prepare. And to argument about some issue from every possible perspective, and to mobilize against some specific occurrence regarding that issue. And I think the left should do something similar, and it is organized by different groups in the left. It is always important to react on different changes in labor legislation, to support workers' protests, to fight against austerity and also privatization in public sector. That is something that is going to be the topic in this year and the next year, with this plan to privatize more than 150 state-owned enterprises. So it is always important to participate in some specific protest and to support it, but also to do organizational work between protests and to be prepared for different topics very thoroughly. Whether it is changes in law or some other issues, I think that is something that has to be done in order to connect different events in time and space. Some of the pretty large protests that were going on in the last 17 years or maybe 26 years or maybe 77 years or whatever can always be forgotten if we don't have like something like some kind of continuation of activities that are not focused only on protesting. So.
Now, usually, I mean, you are against the state, I mean, or let's say, what is the rule of law? I'm interested in this empty space, because Erdogan is a rule of law, and democracy is a rule of law, and we have democratic elected presidents. But we are still asking for the law state and to rule of law. From the other side, I mean, you may ask the destruction, I mean, of such a state. We are weeping for the rule of law, everybody, which already exists. And I'm interested if you can say a few words about this imagination. This is like human rights or whatever, democracy and rule of law. And I want that this seminar comes out of that. I would like very much. That means that if we can be a little less polite. I mean, Michał is speaking about incredible thing, that the people are negotiating about the, how to say, compromise about abortion. I heard from my young friend such a thing. Is abortion or not? Is a freedom or not? Or what is going on? Are we measuring this sense of freedom and democracy? Did we enter the phase in which we are, yes, we have 2 kilometers of democracy and one left and one part is the rule of law? And if you can, just for the end of this morning, say a few words about this weeping for decency, weeping for tolerance, weeping for rule of law, and for democratic elected presidents. What's going on? Yes, you can.
First, just want to say just a few words about this abortion. What I called a compromise, it's not my notion.
No, I know.
This is used by especially by liberals or center right-wing forces in Poland, saying that the law we have now, which is like the second most repressive after Malta in
so
the EU.
I can have a half of abortion.
You can have it only in a situation if it was the effect of violent act, like incest,
so I should be raped, and then
or incest or rape, or if there is a threat to mother's life. These are directly two possibilities when you can do that. Formally, because in practice it's also not so easy. On the other hand, there is widespread tolerance, so to say, or at least it was until 2015, for illegal abortions. Because government was, in fact, it was not persecuting that. So there was this hypocrisy. What changes after 2015, they will probably start to prosecute it.
So freedom is illegal?
In a way. But as to the rule of law, well, the problem in Poland, actually the situation in Poland shows how the typical demo-liberal slogan, which was perceived as empty by many people up to 2015, that it really has some content in it. We can see that when some government tries to destroy it. I mean, what that means exactly in Poland? Well, that's quite simple. Neutralizing the constitutional court, which was it was an institution that was far from being perfect, I would say. It was also the constitutional court which prevented in 1996, as far as I remember, liberalization of the abortion law. So it's from a leftist perspective, it's not a perfect institution. Nevertheless, it was an institution that was able to say that if the government wants to do something, and that it is against the constitution, against this more general liberal framework. Now there is no such an institution anymore, because the constitutional court in Poland formally exists, but it's totally dominated by the people nominated by the ruling party. And very soon we will see what does it mean in terms of judiciary reform. because now the government gets the possibility, because they changed the law, now they have the possibility to manipulate with the nominations of judges for specific courts, which gives them room for maneuver to to manipulate with the people they nominate or not. Some people who are skeptical about the liberal opposition were claiming, well, but what actually did this Kaczyński's government do to legitimize the notion of Poland getting authoritarian or something? Well, they didn't do very much, but until today, until like very recently, they were stopped by the autonomous judiciary. For example, there were cases in which someone was accused by the Attorney General for some crime that was generally, the case was generally perceived as being political, but the judges were autonomous, so they were saying like, sorry, but there is there is no evidence for the accusations. Well, now, up until like very recently, the government didn't have the impact on the judges themselves. Now they will probably get that. So that makes a difference, and so this Polish situation shows how this demo-liberal framework, which was despised by some, especially more radical leftists, it is something that is something worth fighting for. So this is why I think rule of law is not just the slogan from the 90s. It's something vital for the ability to pursue progressive or any kind of independent civic activity. I think so.
Ladies.
I think a very important question that actually our government ruled on the basis of rule of law. Yeah, for example, when we were defending the City Trade Center in Skopje, a very important modernistic building, in research period we realized that they changed the law of construction 6 times average a year in the past 10 years.
You can hear everything is by the law.
And they make total house, and at the end they say it's legal to change the facade in Baroque. But our position was like activists and artists to push them, because it's legal but it's not legitimate. So our position was to find a gap where to fight for this, for their how to say,
for justice.
For justice. And because we have this audio tape affair. With a lot of conversation, and you can hear there how, for example, the Minister of Culture is talking with the Minister of Transport, and how they are removing the protection of cultural heritage of these modernistic buildings. So that's their rule of law. So
here it's everything. It's done by law.
So everything they've done by the law, but at the end it's not like that.
Özge, you have a president done by law. On the free elections.
Talking about democracy, you don't know how he mentions democracy, how much, I mean. After that attempt coup last year in July, the state organized meetings in the centers of big cities, in Ankara and Istanbul mostly, and also conservative towns in the periphery, and they call it democracy nights. So I'm again referring to Michael Hart. He says that we have to invent another term, but not democracy anymore.
Democratic. That's a great title, democratic. What that guy is doing.
Okay, so I think that we are all unfortunately participating in a show of democracy, Because today in Serbia we don't have oppositional political parties and oppositional political policies, and that are currently active. So when you want to participate in democratical mechanisms of political participation or whatever, you can vote. And if you go to vote, you can vote for the only option. So when you have no other option on the table, whatever you choose, you voted for the option. So that is one point of view. The another is the international support that option has. So mostly because of his neoliberal politics that he is supporting. So when the international leaders are supporting these authorities and see him as a factor of stability, not only in Serbia but in a region as well, then you are aware that this is not democracy. If you go by day to vote for this option, and that is the top of citizen political participation, and by night the same state and authorities go and demolish some buildings and some in the center of Belgrade, you then know that this is not democracy.
For Jelena, I just wanted to remind you all, I forgot, this is how this conference works. Yesterday, public debate was open about law on dual education, and I think that also very much illustrates the rule of law. In Serbia, the law that will rule will be as the dual education law, which will legalize the exploitation of children in their labor. So, Jelena, do you have a comment?
Yes, because we can talk about the rule of law, and at some point I think you can really find some differences between how government acted and what was the circumstances specific, like lack of support from the international community or whatever, that led to some governments to maybe go into this concept of rule of law, or maybe to respect their own laws. But at some point, like especially in the last 5 years here, when you have like this coalition that has a pretty stable majority in the parliament, we cannot really talk. We have to go beyond rule of law. We also have to talk about the laws that are being passed and implemented, because there is like total lack of analysis, total lack of like public discussion about some laws that are being passed. Not only like this law on dual education that will turn like minors, students into like cheap labor force, but also on like law, different types of labor regulations, education regulations, or those involved concerned with healthcare and everything else. So yeah, sometimes it is important to focus like on issues of how government is going against their own laws, but sometimes we will have to
against all the citizens.
Yes. But we will have to focus also on the laws. I don't think we should like go for, in some cases, go for like obeying the law, which is like totally crazy.
Yeah, exactly.
So.
Thank you. It is for Özge. You said at the end something like, what I didn't really understood, probably it was depressive. you talked about depression and depressive situation. I guess you talked about the current situation in Turkey. And could you elaborate a little bit more on this, say more things? And I have a more precise question. I mean, all the legacy of the Gezi Park that you have explained with the protest movements, is there something for a potential change? Are there signs of resistance in the current situation, kind of a legacy of the Gezi Park, so that we will hope some kind of change? Or they are trivial protests that are dismissed by the government like kind of a routine? Is there some pressure to the current government, I mean, with...
It's because of the pressure of the government, of course. Because, I mean, after Gezi, after Gezi, in that short period, there were many protests and forums and like public assemblies came together in the parks, and then the elections came. Yeah, after. Yeah, okay. I'm just trying to. Because how I should explain how we came to coup, so it's maybe more understandable. The first elections, the parliament elections, the HDP pro-Kurdish party, they got the like 15% of the whole votes. And then Erdogan's party, the ruler party, they decided to organize another elections and just cancel that one because of the attacks. And yes, they also after that suicide attacks, they organized another election, and at that election they got the like almost 50% of the whole votes. I am trying to have Erdogan legitimize his authority. I mean, he organized those elections, and they organized that attempt coup, and they created that policies under the state of emergency, and over 100,000 people were dismissed from the governmental institutions, and they lost their jobs, and they banned to go out. They prohibited to leave the country. They are. Most of them are part of those social movements or left syndicates, member of the syndicates, and so on. So they created that fear of atmosphere and threatening all those democratic parties, groups, and organizations. Many NGOs were banned to active to organize events. We also had to close our NGO. Yes, and we have been ruling the country under the state of emergency rules since last year. Yes, so there's a depressive period. I mean, people are like they have fears to go out on the streets. They don't want to be. It's a silent period. It's because of this. Like after Gezi, I mean, I'm just trying to summarize the situation. It happened in 4 years. It has been changed very rapidly. And the protests and marches were also like banned. I mean, it's and if you are taken under custody, you can be kept there for 45 days.
are you tired? Being involved in that situation, or you?
Yes, I am tired.
I see that you are suffering.
Yes, yeah.
And it's really horrifying.
Yes, yes, it is.
Such a
and
disaster.
A lot of my friends, they are in prison now. One of them is a video activist. They put them in jail, and the attorney is resisting to write his the reason, the reports. So they are keeping him in prison, and like a lot of friends taken under custody because they are documenting the protests on the street, that teachers protest, dismissal peoples. So yes, I am
we
suffering. Yeah.
Terror.
It's yes, maybe it's. I'm not sure if it's about fear, but I sometimes yes, I have hesitations to be in front. But I followed their protest, that teachers, academics hunger strike. Yeah, I was there. I mean, I was on the street. But after they put them into prison, the police banned the monument, human rights monument in Ankara, with the police barracks. It's also symbolic. It has a symbolic meaning. The image itself, the monument surrounded with the police barricades, and after they put them in jail, like since more than 2 weeks, it's really the police intervention is really harsh, has been really harsh. So I hesitate. Yeah.
Thank you all.
Yes.
You somehow encouraged me with this when you brought up this issue of fear. I was hesitating to ask this a bit, but like with bringing up this question of fear, and on the other hand, Borka, you said like, let us be more outspoken, like straightforward. What about the violence? Is violence legitimate? When you mentioned we should go beyond the rule of law, I thought you would said something about violence, but you didn't. But is somehow, could violence be some kind of strategy? Is there room for violence in this triangle of art, aesthetic, revolution? Or is it just on the sides of those democratically elected presidents? You said about naturalization of violence in Turkey and all over. Though they are very, neat and polite. Our establishment is neat and polite. You couldn't describe them as violent as such. So I wonder if you think that violence within your activities or organizations could be legitimate, or like whatever. What's your opinion about it? So not only rule of law, but like what about the violence?
You mean the revolution?
Well, my answer would be, as for my local context, would be clearly no. I mean, and this is because of many reasons. Ethical is, of course, one of them, but the other is that the political argument, I think, I think there would be two political arguments why it's not a topic at all or it shouldn't, in my opinion, shouldn't be a topic for progressive forces. The one is that we live in Europe, in the West, or else, however you define it, we live in a state of different kinds of threats connected to so-called hot security, like from imperial ideas in different neighboring countries to, like, just simple as that, threat of terrorism because of with very different ideological backgrounds. So any kind of resorting to violence is brilliant argument for the government to make a state into a to make the situation into an emergency state. It happens either in pretty much democratic countries as in France, as well as in many others. And and this is also the experience of history. Like if you take West Germany in the 70s, that's a very good example. Democratic country which was far from perfect in late 60s became almost a state of emergency in the late 70s, using, of course, the terrorist attacks as the excuse or as an argument, with a very, very broad social support for that, because the huge majority of West German society accepted many instruments used by the government which many of them were, of course, very problematic from human rights perspective. That's one thing, and the other is, it came to my mind when Filip mentioned the situation of the right-wing or counter-revolutionary forces intervening, intruding into the government, into the parliament building and beating the opposition, being tolerated by the police. Well, I think in using violence, all the possible right-wing, nationalist, reactionary, whatever you call it, forces, they are much more effective in that. This was a very famous answer by Jacek Kuroń, Polish leftist dissident from the 70s and the 80s, who was asked about the idea of non-violence. He was asked about that by very different, mostly radical activists from the West. Why is actually Solidarność embracing this idea of non-violence? And his question was actually not an ethical one, but a very pragmatic one. Well, we have the Soviet tanks on the other side, so what do you want? So you want to beat them like with the sticks or with what? So like the non-violence is always the force and the instrument of the weaker side, and it's simple as that. And it's nothing bad in that. It's nothing bad in saying that there is a pragmatic argument which is coherent with an ethical one. It is even better when you have when you have both ethical argument in favor of non-violence and you have a pragmatic one at the same time, saying it's politically much better. I think it's nothing bad in that. I mean, saying that what is right and what is politically effective, that when these both cohere, when they correspond with each other, that's even better, and that's even stronger, makes the argument even stronger. So I'm speaking of my local Polish context. I think there is no legitimate claim in favor of using violence.
I think that there are levels of violence, and in Turkey it's in the history there are really harsh interventions, especially in Kurdish towns. And after Gezi and after the elections at pro-Kurdish party's victory, that they break the peace agreement and attacked Kurdish towns, and many civilians were killed recently. That I am talking about in that 4 years period. And when, like in the western towns, in Turkish towns, during the protests, they can take you under custody and they torture you, and you might lose your life, or you may be injured and abandoned to leave the country. You have to stay in a sort of a prison. Yes, there are levels. If you are a Kurd, it's the level is higher than the Turkish part. But there's a motto of political activists, like breaking the fear. You have to break your fear. Because it's your life, you are losing your life. You don't have anything to lose, so break your fear. But it's not easy because we have families, we have friends, we have connections, we have comrades. I mean, you have to also consider your network. So that I have hesitations, yes. It's not about my own life.
Can I just answer something to you? Like this, what you said about right-wing people, somehow it fits them better to be violent, something like this you said. I mean, you know, this anti-fascist movement, for example, in Germany, they have this like so-called black bloc. You know about that. I mean, they're super violent and scary people, but thanks to them, we stopped the Nazi march recently, like a few weeks ago in the time where I live. So that's why I'm asking, like, is violence in some cases legitimate? And you know, why not? So.
Just one sentence of the answer. I said quite openly that I'm speaking in my local context. So that's not, yeah, that would be that. So what I know and what I know about people's popular attitudes towards that, and what I know about the relations of power within the society, I would say. So that's in my Polish context I would say what I said is still legitimate. But yeah, of course, there is an argument that there are of course groups from like left-wing side and the hooligans of FC St. Pauli Hamburg, for example. Yeah, they are such a group maybe, but still, recently I wrote in a short article that criticizing somebody's radical claims, saying that he supposedly forgot that FC St. Pauli Hamburg plays in Bundesliga and not in Polish league. So yeah, so this is why I think we should speak in our context, because they differ so much. Like for example in Turkey, which like the Kurds case, it really makes my statements also very problematic about violence, because they are in a totally different situation than we are in Poland, for example, with Prawo i Sprawiedliwość.
We have one. Yes, but I just wanted to add something about this violence, because we were talking about it, and there is like a poster regarding monuments to the People's Liberation Movement, and was it a non-violent struggle? Of course, it was a very violent struggle, and especially also the situation in Kurdistan, and it is not only, it is about context, of course, but it is also a question of decisions made by different groups in some specific situations on how to react, and so that is also a question. And I don't think it should be also discussed in public events. In terms of actions and strategic actions and tactics and in operational sense.
I'm very glad it's an open question, because it's a question that is very usually avoided among activists in the Western Balkans. It's like, you mentioned violence, the spooky man, now everybody's going to go to jail. I wouldn't question the legitimacy when you have a captured state that is capturing and abusing every resource, especially the monopoly on use of force. Sometimes people are left with no other choice but to respond in violence. I think we are still in a very relaxed position when we compare ourselves with Turkey. We are going in that direction, but we are not there yet. But in the Western Balkan regions, the use of violence, I think, is more of a question of efficiency rather than legitimacy. We are fighting with regimes that are still not outrightly violent. So even though in some cases it is legitimate when a corrupt police officer is attacking you, you have every right to defend yourself, and sometimes that means violence. But for me the question is, what are we going to achieve? Are we going to feed into the narrative that we are leftist radicals that want chaos and anarchy, or are we going to emancipate somehow people. For example, in Macedonia, the painting of the buildings was very much narrated and contextualized as violence, and it was used extensively by the propaganda as hooligans who are trying to destroy the fake cultural heritage. So just to keep it short, I'm glad it's an open discussion, and I think it's a thing that needs to be discussed very openly and frankly.
Unfortunately, now when it got interesting, we have to stop because of our schedule. And that is our game of suspense. Tomorrow on plenum, we can note this to be continued. Whatever we have to interrupt because of our very tight schedule, we will continue tomorrow at open plenum. You're all invited to continue all these topics. So, coffee break, and see you in 20 minutes, half an hour. We'll be tolerant.